Good evening, everyone. My name is Chuck Ekman. I'm the Dean of Library Services at Simon Fraser University. On behalf of the Simon Fraser University Libraries and SFU's Public Square program, I want to invite you to this evening's event here. This is a really great turnout, and I'm really delighted whenever I see a Hollywood blockbuster film drive a book-related event of this sort. I think it's really terrific turnabout, an event where people can have a chance to rediscover history a bit and enjoy the book. I am going to just quickly introduce the event and turn it over to Shauna Sylvester to my left, who is the director of the SFU Public Square program and who will be introducing our two speakers and moderating the program. And with that, I'm going to turn this over immediately.
Thank you so much. Did you notice the way Chuck, in a very librarian way, got us all? He just waited until we were all very quiet and then started. As Chuck mentioned, my name is Shauna Sylvester, and I'm the executive director of the SFU Public Square, and I wanted to say a big welcome. I also wanted to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. Now, we have a tradition at the SFU Public Square, and that's at the beginning of any event. We get you to turn to somebody you don't know and just introduce yourself and perhaps say why you chose to come tonight. So just find somebody you don't know, look around, and just introduce yourselves.
Hard for us, we're not near anybody. We're not near anybody.
So whereabouts are you in Washington? Oh, lovely. I've got a place in Point Roberts. So I look over towards, I guess it's Cortez Island I'm looking at. No, what would the one that I'd be looking at? Yeah. So Point Roberts, if you've never been there, is a very odd little place. Okay. Are we all set? So let me explain how tonight is going to go. The format for this evening is we are going to hear from our guests this evening. They're going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then really it's a dialogue, and this is a chance for you to really open up a conversation with Mark and Cora. So we'll have Baharak Yousefi, who is right there. Do you want to just put up your hand? She'll be carrying the mic around, and I'll just sort of recognize people. So if you have an interest in asking a question, make sure I can see you. It's a little hard some there, but we'll get the lights brought up a little bit later so that we can see you. And don't worry about waving your hand, so I do acknowledge you. And then Baharak will bring the mic to you so you have a chance to ask the question. When we do get to the questions, we like to get as many as we can in, so try and keep them short and pithy, and we'll get the discussion flowing. So I have a great pleasure in introducing the two of you. You're a husband and wife team, so I'm going to introduce you together if that's okay. Mark Lijek is a retired Foreign Services officer whose career began in Iran just prior to the 1979 hostage crisis. And I'm loving the glasses, Mark. They're great.
I like the hair myself, actually. Forget the glasses.
Cora Lijek, the two of you were among the 6 Americans able to escape the compound and find refuge with the staff of the Canadian Embassy. You eventually fled to Iran with CIA assistance. The story of the escape, as I'm sure you all know, became the basis for the 2013 Best Picture winning film Argo. After Iran, Mark and Cora went off to your assignments with the Foreign Service in Hong Kong, Nepal, Poland, and Germany, as well as Washington, D.C. Mark holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and has an MBA from the American University. He was a minor consultant to Argo and is the author of The House Guests, a memoir of Canadian courage and CIA sorcery, as well as a number of articles dealing with the Canadian role in his escape. Cora has a BA in history and an MA in English as a second language from Georgetown University. I'm wondering where you met. She also served as a minor consultant for Argo, and the two of them now live in Washington State on Anacortes and have 2 grown children. Cora also works with the Skagit Conservation District. Welcome, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Much. Yeah, Is my volume okay? It sounds very loud to me. Okay, fine. This is not a cheat sheet. I mean, we don't read our talk, but because I tend to do this myself, this tells me when to let her talk. So it's kind of important. So anyway, she gets to start.
I just wanted to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about. Basically, Mark's going to give a little political background to what was going on in Iran at the time he was assigned, how he got to Iran, and how I got there because we did not arrive at the same time. And then we'll talk about the day of the attack, what happened after that, our life with the Canadians, and then finally our escape, and then go to questions.
Well, I guess I should start also by saying thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for coming. Excuse me, for coming. I was assigned to Tehran. It was in October of 1978, my first tour. I'd been in the Foreign Service for all of 3 weeks when I was asked to volunteer to go to Iran. And well, I don't know, new higher officers don't generally have a lot of say where they go. So I'm not sure what would have happened if we'd said no, but Cora and I talked about it, and being young and foolish, we thought, hey, what could go wrong, right? So we agreed to go. And in October, things were still okay. The Shah was hanging on. The CIA famously declared that Iran was not yet in even a pre-revolutionary state. And of course, 2 months later, the country was falling apart, and by January of '79, the Shah had fled, and I think it was the first day of February of '79, Ayatollah Khomeini returned. He was never elected to anything, but the millions of Iranians that greeted him in the streets effectively made him the ruler of the country. So he appointed a provisional government made up of the secular democratic opposition, and then also something called the Revolutionary Council. And we didn't really understand the relationship between the two very well, but over the next few months, it became pretty clear that the Revolutionary Council had the power, or at least that's what the embassy argued. The Department of State continued to believe that the provisional government had a role to play in Iran's future and that cultivating relations with it was worthwhile. And that's basically what our embassy was tasked to do. And it was a big issue because, frankly, that's the main purpose of an embassy, is to develop relations. We wanted to, well, after the Shah's departure, of course, Iran had been a big ally of ours, but after the Shah left, then we needed to try to rebuild something, to salvage something with the new government. And the real question was, were we talking to somebody that was an authority or not? I will mention one last thing that happened in February of 1979 on Valentine's Day. The embassy was attacked and taken over for about 3 hours. And this was both good and bad. I mean, it was very traumatic for the employees, but it created, in a sense, a false belief that the provisional government could deal with security issues, because they bailed us out. Prime Minister Ibrahim Yazdi, or sorry, Deputy Prime Minister Ibrahim Yazdi came and negotiated the withdrawal of the attacking group and returned the embassy to us. So the people in Washington thought, oh, this Yazdi guy, you know, he's got power, and that it was worth talking to the government that he was connected to. Oh, yes, sorry. And anyway, so I arrived in July of '79, and I was going to, well, let me say, before I left, you know, we were getting briefed by the Iran desk, and they were telling us basically that things were pretty good, and that we should expect, you know, some difficulties, but it was okay. And when I got there, I found a situation that was rather different. For example, my first day, I went to lunch at the embassy restaurant, and there's a big sign on the door, check your weapons. And thought, well, okay, I don't have a weapon, but I asked my boss, and he said, well, that refers to the Embassy Comité. This is a revolutionary committee, and it was a bit of a shock because nobody in Washington thought it was worth mentioning. I mean, an embassy is sovereign soil, right? Sovereign American soil, and yet we had about a dozen armed young men carrying AK-47s that made their living selling booze and cigarettes out of the commissary and visas. And we were actually told to issue a certain quota of visas to these folks. They would bring in their friends, in quotes. So it was a very different situation than I'd been led to expect.
When Tehran was an unaccompanied post, so there were no dependents at post, and the tourist and student visa section was closed, and the State Department wanted to reopen it. So they put out a worldwide request asking for Farsi speakers, and they got no volunteers. Kathy Stafford and I had just finished 6 months of Farsi training, and there was a new pilot program for spouses to take the consular course, and we had completed that course. So eventually, Mark left in July. By the end of the summer, Kathy and I got permission to go. So we were the only dependents at post. So I arrived in Tehran in September, and the first thing Mark said to me when I arrived was, "I wish you hadn't come," which is, was like, oh no. But things, unfortunately, were much worse than we had been told. And then, unfortunately, when the government decided to allow the Shah to come into the U.S. for medical treatment, they got worse. We started to have demonstrations in front of the embassy every day, and a couple of weeks passed before the embassy was attacked, and we kind of thought we'd made it through and everything would be okay. But on the morning of November 4th, we came to work. There were demonstrators, which was kind of normal. But over the weekend, there had, I guess, been a lot of demonstrations. We'd been out of town, and there was graffiti all over the wall. And so in protest, our chargé had closed the tourist and student section that day, and he and the deputy chief of mission and the head of security were at the foreign ministry actually asking for extra security. So unfortunately, that's what we needed, but we didn't get it. So about 9:30, two of our local employees who had gone out to buy some cookies came running in. They were completely hysterical because apparently they'd been chased outside on the grounds, and a policeman who was the ex-husband of one of the women had told them to get inside. The compound was very large, about 26 acres. So in the movie, you see people coming over the wall. We did not see that. We were too far away. And after they came in, the Marine who was on our floor directed us to go upstairs to the Immigrant and American Services section.
We were in our building for about 2 hours. Again, unlike Argo, it shows us kind of running out as the Iranians came in. But in fact, they left our building pretty much alone. As Cora mentioned, we were some distance from the gate where they initially attacked, and they focused on the Chancery building, which is where most of the Americans worked and where all the sexy stuff like the CIA and the communications section and most of the classified was located. Our building was next to the commissary, and they actually, when they finally got up to our part of the compound, they were more interested in the commissary. It had things like 100 cases of Gallo Thunderbird and cigarettes and stuff. And we saw people running in and out. It became like a beehive of activity. And only later did somebody actually start paying attention to us. Our building was newly renovated and quite secure, but the geniuses had forgotten about the bathrooms. And so all of a sudden we hear glass breaking in the upstairs bathroom, and a Marine runs in there and he sees a guy has put a ladder up against the wall and is trying to climb up. So he pushed the ladder away and dropped a tear gas grenade down onto the people below. And that was literally the only effort made to get into our building, which was fortunate because all we could do was secure the bathroom doors with some coat hanger wire, and any serious attack would have been able to break through, but it didn't happen. Instead, the power went out. Atmosphere got a little tenser. Twice we were told to get ready to march over to the Chancery, which we did not understand what the purpose of that was, but we also didn't know at the time that our security officer had been mingling with the attackers. The movie Argo shows him going outside and then having a gun put to his head, and that's how they break into the Chancery building. That is true, but it ignores the fact that he had been out there for quite a while actually talking with the demonstrators and had found out that the majority of them seemed to want to stage a sit-in, and at least that's what they told him. But there was a second group with a more sinister agenda, and when they got him, they used the threat of shooting him basically to force their way into the Chancery. I think at the point that happened is when we stopped being told that we were going to march over there, and shortly thereafter the plan changed. It became, let's go to the British Embassy. So the first thing we had to do was find out if we could get out. I mean, we had a door to the street that would normally be used by visa applicants coming in for interviews, but because we had such great security, we couldn't see outside. There were no windows, one, but it was useless, a tiny little slit in my office, and the cameras, of course, were out because there was no power. So we didn't know what was out there. We had to take a gamble. The Marine opened the door. One of our guys went out, and he came back a minute later and said, there's 3 cops out there, but they have no objection to us leaving. So the Consul General told the Iranian visitors and employees that they could go home, or in the case of the employees, go to the British Embassy if they chose. And then he told us to break up into 2 groups and head over to the British. We were in the first group, and is this Cora's part? I think it is. So I'll turn it over to you.
I just want to mention, as we talk about this part, we talk about 5 of us, and that's because the 6th actually didn't join us for a couple of weeks, so just so there's any confusion. So Kathy Stafford, Joe Stafford, Mark, and I were in one group, and then there were probably another 6 Americans behind us. One of our local employees offered to guide us to the British Embassy because we actually didn't even know where it was. And Bob Anders, for some reason, hurried up and joined our group, and we were walking along, and as we got about 2 blocks in front of the British Embassy, the local employee pulled me into an alley because she had seen there was a huge demonstration going on in front of the British Embassy. So there was no way that we could make our way through the crowd to get inside. She offered to take us home with her, and we just didn't think that would be a very good idea to put her in that kind of jeopardy. I think she lived in an apartment, if I recall, so it wasn't like she had a house she could really hide us in. And because of the takeover of the embassy in February, at that time and for several days, we would continue to think it will be over soon. It'll be a few hours. It'll just be today. It'll just be a few days. And that kind of guided us in the decisions we made. So we felt we just needed to get off the street, and in a few hours it would be over. Bob Anders, the older fellow in our group, lived nearby, and he suggested we go to his apartment. We actually had 2 Americans with us. One was a fellow who was having a problem with his passport. He decided to go off on his own. There was an American woman who'd been in the consulate doing some paperwork for her Iranian husband. She went with us. So 6 of us went to Bob's apartment. We were there for several hours. During that time, we had emergency radios. We could hear what was going on at the embassy. And as time went on, we heard more and more Farsi, more and more Iranian voices. And then about 3:30 in the afternoon, we heard Charlie Jones, who was one of the communicators and in the vault trying to destroy crypto equipment and documents, tell Washington, apparently, he was talking on the phone, we're going to have to open the vault door, there's smoke coming under the door. And that was a very depressing moment because we knew now that the embassy had completely fallen to the attackers.
Just one comment. The private American who was with us, I was helping him get out of Iran because he had lost his passport and needed an exit visa. He did get out about 10 days later and turned up on Walter Cronkite and told the whole world that there was a group of escaped American diplomats on the loose in Tehran. So very, very helpful. And in fact, the story had got quite a bit of traction in Iran, and I don't know why it didn't lead to a more concerted effort to find us, but fortunately it did not. Anyway, we, in the interest of time, I will kind of condense the next 6 days because we moved 5 times during that period. Again, Argo kind of makes it seem like we just magically appeared on the Canadian embassy doorstep. And in fact, we had, that really for me was the scariest time because we were kind of on our own. We spent one night at the British compound, but then the next morning they put us into the house of one of the hostages, and they never explained why. Only later did we learn that the compound we were hiding in, their residential compound, came this close to being taken over the night we were there. And the British were probably not the best people to hide with because after the Americans, they were the most hated by the Iranians, and so it made sense that we not be there. And Washington agreed with the decision, but nobody told us, so we felt betrayed. And we were in this house that under the care of a housekeeper, a Thai gentleman who really did a great job for us. He worked for our deputy chief of mission, one of the Americans who was stuck at the foreign ministry, and they were able to arrange for him to, the two of them arranged for Sam to take us in. That was our name for him. We couldn't pronounce the Thai name, but Sam really did take good care of us for about four days that we were with him. And unfortunately, the housekeeper that worked for the owner, the occupant of the house, I should say, was an elderly lady who did not understand what was going on. Her concern was that her boss was going to come home and find 5 strangers in the house and she'd be fired. And Sam decided there was no way to explain to her that that her boss wasn't likely to come home, or that would just make things worse. And he really feared that she would turn us into the local Revolutionary Committee. So he decided to move us to another house 2 blocks away. This was on the morning of Saturday, November 10th. And we got to that house, and we could see right away that we couldn't stay there. It had low walls, big windows, and it was also the house of a hostage. It hadn't been occupied in a week, and we knew the moment we turned a light switch on that the local Revolutionary Committee would be there in a flash to see what was going on. So fortunately, a couple days earlier, Bob Anders, as Cora mentioned, was the senior man in our group, called his Canadian counterpart and good friend, John Sheardown, and John's response was, "Why didn't you call sooner?" And Bob said, "Well, it's not just me, there's 5 of us." And John replied, "Bring them all." And it wasn't just a suggestion, it was almost an order. So we were very encouraged by that response. And the reason we didn't immediately act on it were 2 things. Well, one, we knew whoever had us would be taking a big risk. And we seemed to be okay for a while in the house we were hiding in. And secondly, after the experience with the British, we didn't know if we could trust, we didn't realize Canadians were more trustworthy than the Brits, and we thought that, the same thing might happen again. They might change their mind. So we waited a couple days, but once we'd moved from the good house into this obviously untenable one, Bob Anders called John Sheardown again, and they arranged transportation for us. And by 1 o'clock on Saturday, November 10th, we were sitting in John Sheardown's parlor having drinks, and I finally got up the courage to ask John whether this was something he was doing on his own or whether his ambassador knew what he had, that he'd taken us in. And he said to me, he kind of smiled and he said, "Well, you're sitting next to the ambassador." I didn't realize, Ken Taylor was very young looking. I thought he was maybe John's assistant or something. And I thought ambassadors, looked like I do now, kind of old guys, that have been around forever. And so it was a nice surprise. And Taylor at that point said that the Canadians were committed to helping us, that the Prime Minister, Joe Clark, had approved the operation, and that we were welcome to stay until either the hostages were released or some other way was found to get us out of the country. Am I turning it over to you now? Okay.
So once we were with the Canadians, we felt very safe. We were protected, and we knew that we would be okay. And our life was, especially when you think about the hostages downtown and what they were going through, was pretty amazing. We were comfortable. We were well fed. The Canadians took really good care of us. 3 of us initially stayed with the Sheerdowns, and the Staffords went to the ambassador's house, or in the movie they have us all together, but they split us up because Ambassador Taylor wanted to be sure it was very clear that it wasn't a renegade officer who decided to take us in, but he, the ambassador, was in on the plan as well. So at our house, there was one housekeeper who was a Filipina, and she was told from the beginning who we were. And I think John promised her an immigrant visa, and she apparently is a Canadian and lives in Canada now. The Staffords had 3 or 4 employees at their house, and they were not told who they were. They were just told they were visitors, and I think they might have told them that Joe had a nervous breakdown or something, because Joe and Kathy never left the house except on just a few occasions when they were brought over to visit us. And when dinner guests would come, Joe and Kathy would go into their room and stay there. So obviously that's rather strange behavior for visitors. Oops, something. Kathy said the cook, the Pakistani cook, actually told her if they needed to go somewhere else, they could go to his house. So he obviously figured out who they were and offered them sanctuary, which is pretty amazing. But life at the Sheerdowns, as I said, was very comfortable. Boredom was probably our biggest problem, and we all kind of dealt with it in different ways. We read a lot, played games. The Sheerdowns would actually have dinner parties and invite some diplomats who knew about us, particularly the Danish ambassador and a couple of the ambassador from New Zealand and another guy, Richard Sewell, from the New Zealand embassy as well. And we had actually had a wonderful Thanksgiving and probably one of the best Christmases I've ever had, which is kind of amazing. We stayed in the house most of the time. We did have to leave a couple of times because the house was for sale and prospective buyers came. And that was disconcerting, being in a vehicle, feeling like you're a goldfish in a bowl, that people are looking at you, because there were not that many foreigners in Tehran by that time. But by January, we began to feel we'd been there a long time. The Canadians had taken a big risk, and the longer we stayed there, the more chance there was that by accident someone would find out about us, or one of us would get sick and need to have to go to a doctor or hospital. So Mark and Bob Anders drafted a cable to be sent to Washington saying, we know the hostages are priority, but we think you need to be thinking about us and get us out. Up to that point, we were told the plan was, when the hostages' release was negotiated, a group of foreign ambassadors would take the 6 of us and say, oh, excuse us, there's 6 more. And we didn't think that was a very good plan, because it could totally squelch the negotiations. They might say, oh no, everybody, back in the embassy, because we haven't questioned these people. And then they say we were the spies because we got away. And that they also needed to question us. So take it from there. And I forgot to mention Lee.
Yes, well, after about a week, we got our 6th. If you follow the movie, there were 6 house guests. The 6th was a fellow named Lee Schatz. He was our agricultural attaché. His office was in the same building as the Swedish embassy, so he was able to take refuge with them, and he spent about 2 weeks there. The Swedes were kind of nervous about it, so ultimately their ambassador approached Ken Taylor and said, I've got this American, but we think he'd fit in better with you guys. And Ken said, well, that's okay. I've already got 5. One more won't cause any problems. And so Lee came to join us. And at that point, we had 4 of us with the Sheerdowns and Joe and Kathy staying with the ambassador. Cora mentioned that we asked Taylor to send this telegram. I don't think it was ever sent, but the gist of it, I think, was communicated, and it was very similar to what Ottawa was telling Washington. In Argo, they make this absurd statement that the Canadians were going to close their embassy and sort of leave us there, or in that, maybe under the floor, I don't know. But in fact, what Ottawa was saying to Washington was the same thing that we were, that it's been too long, you can't, Murphy's Law is going to catch up with us sooner or later, so you need to come up with a plan to get these people out. And the Canadians, I think, could rightly say, we went out on a limb for these people, we've been taking a big risk, and it's now time to do something. So about a week or so after we had our meeting with Ken, he came back to us and asked how we would feel leaving with U.S. passports. And we, I think the gist was not very well. I mean, we really weren't comfortable with the idea of traveling on U.S. passports. So he just kind of noted that and left. But it gave me a sense that maybe something was finally in the works.
About mid-January, John Sheardown was reassigned to Kuwait because they had moved the visa section to Kuwait. They were downsizing, getting ready to close. And John and Zena felt really badly about leaving. They wanted to see us leave. They wanted to see it through to the end. And we felt very badly that they were leaving too, because they'd become like family to us. But we knew they had to go, particularly because Zena was a British citizen and she didn't have a diplomatic passport. Although, our having diplomatic passports didn't help either, but hopefully she would have been protected if she'd had a Canadian one. And then about 10 days later, we were told we would have a visitor, and Tony Mendez and another man named Julio came for dinner. After dinner, they took us back to the den where we spent most of our time and gave us 3 scenarios of departing Iran. One was the Hollywood scenario, one was that we were agronomists, one is we were we worked in oil. Well, we didn't know anything about agronomy. It was winter time, so it wouldn't be a good time to be looking at crops. And we know nothing about oil, and there's lots of people in Iran who know about oil, so we certainly couldn't have, if somebody asked us questions, we couldn't answer them. And it was very clear that Tony wanted us to pick the Hollywood story. He was very charming, and he had a lot of backup to it. He had a script on hand, he had storyboards. There were people in California to answer the phone if someone called and asked if Teresa Harris was working on the movie, where was she? And he also had put ads in the Hollywood Reporter and another, I think maybe Variety, which he had with him. And so, we felt comfortable with this. And, Mark always says, and I think this is true, that one of the reasons Tony picked this cover story is, one, who would go to Iran in the middle of a revolution? The people from Hollywood? Yeah, probably. They think they're kind of above everything and will go to crazy places. But also, I think he thought it was something that we could have fun with and be relaxed, because we're obviously not professional disguise masters or spies. And I think he thought that cover story would be the most fun for us.
We voted after the presentation, after Tony made the presentation of the 3 options, we went into a different room and discussed it amongst ourselves for a few minutes. It was pretty obvious that there was a clear consensus in favor of Hollywood, so we took a vote. It was 5 for favor, 1 abstention, and that was Joe Stafford. As the movie shows, Joe just didn't want to leave, and it wasn't because of the scenario, it was for personal reasons of his own. So we went back to Tony and said, we're good with that option. He gave us our information. Everybody got a piece of paper that we had to memorize, and they left. And so the next day, the 27th of January, we worked on memorizing our new identities and also packing. The Canadians had scrounged up suitcases and clothes that at least were, in most cases, for the right sex. I mean, I don't know if they fit.
No, my clothes didn't fit. They're way too big.
Somebody gave me a rather exotic set of underwear that I was going to hang it on my wall, but it disappeared. I don't know who would have stolen something like that. But it was some kind of thong thingy. But anyway, I guess it was suitably Hollywood.
There was a Frenchman at the embassy, so. Claude.
You mean Claude? No, this was
too small.
Yeah, too small for Claude. But anyway, so we were getting ready. Then that evening we had a big party. We invited the New Zealanders, the Danish ambassador, the people that kind of been with us through the whole thing, and as well as the Canadian ambassador and the Canadians and Tony and Julio. And basically the intent was to try to drink all the booze left in the house so we wouldn't leave anything for the Iranians. And we called it the alcohol and adrenaline strategy of exfiltration. And one good thing about Tony is he was very comfortable with us being silly, and I think he kind of encouraged it because he realized that as long as we were relaxed and having fun, then we'd be less likely to seize up at the airport, and that was his concern, is that we not do that, not not be nervous when we get there. So after dinner, we did the mock interrogations, kind of like they show in the movie, except it wasn't Tony doing it. It was Roger Lucy, the head of Chancery at the Canadian Embassy, and this fellow Richard Sewell, who was the attaché from the New Zealand Embassy. They were doing the interrogations. And basically, you can't simulate the kind of fear that we would have felt, but what they were doing was throwing the questions at us so quickly that if we didn't have the information down cold, we wouldn't be able to answer. And I think it was reasonably effective. Again, the point, I think, in Tony's mind was to build up our comfort level. Unlike in the film, we didn't have pages and pages and pages of stuff. It was a one-page document and enough to make us, we could handle it. I think he was more concerned that if we were given too much stuff, then we'd be nervous about the fact we didn't remember what the fourth movie ago was that we allegedly worked on, and that we'd then tense up when we were going through the airport. And so it was pretty simple stuff. And basically after we practiced, we went to bed. It was probably, I say 1 a.m., but you say later.
It was later. We only had about 2 or 3 hours of sleep.
Yeah, because we had to leave at 4:30 for the airport. So, and on top of that, Lee Schatz stayed up with Joe Stafford trying to persuade him that leaving was the right thing to do. I could hear them droning on and on for another hour and a half, so they got hardly any sleep at all.
So on the morning of January 28th, we got into the Canadian consulate vehicle. The driver didn't know who we were, so as far as he was concerned, we were from Hollywood. So it started as we left the house, saying goodbye to Roger Lucy. We had about a half an hour drive, to the airport in the dark, and I think all of us were thinking about everything that could go wrong. I know I was looking through my pockets and my purse to make sure I didn't have anything with my true name on it, and I did find something and shoved it into the back of the seat. And then when we got to the airport, we had not really been in a public place for almost 3 months. So all of a sudden we're going into a brightly lit place with a lot of people. So that in itself was kind of scary. But as we walked in, we saw Tony waiting for us. He was smiling. I think there was a signal. If there was something wrong, he was supposed to signal to us, so we would just turn around and get back in the vehicle. We proceeded through customs and immigration and really had no problems, unlike in the movie. The only 2 issues that happened is, for some reason, at one of the stops, the person looking at Lee Schatz thought his mustache wasn't long enough. It didn't match the picture. So he just put his fingers like this and he waved him on, so he was fine. And then Mark and I got to, I think it was the immigration stop, and there was no one there. So we talked about, should we just go by? Or, later on, is somebody going to say we were supposed to have a stamp in our passport, so we didn't have? So I actually had to go around the counter and through a door to find the immigration officer. He was making tea, and so he came out, he took our papers, he didn't even look at them. And that's in the movie. They talk about the carbons and how they were worried that they were going to try to pick up match our sheet with the carbon, while the CIA had been debriefing people who were going through the airport, and apparently they hadn't been checking. So the same thing happened that morning. They did not check the paperwork, and in fact, I think the fellow dropped the papers on the floor, because the next thing I knew, Tony had our papers in his hand. So, and we went through to the waiting area, and then finally to the second and final waiting area, and it was announced that our plane would be delayed for 3 hours. Which is, so they say 3 hours is going to be 6 hours. So Tony gathered us together. He said he'd find out what was going on. There were some people, Richard Sewell and others, who were in the airport kind of watching what was going on, and we think that Tony went to talk to Richard, who talked to the British Airways agent, who, according to Mark, is MI6.
Well, that's not according to me, that's according to a lot of people.
Okay.
Anyway.
But anyway, he was able to verify the plane would be ready to go in 20 minutes. So that was a great relief. We actually had a second set of tickets for another flight, but Tony said it would look very suspicious. We're in the final waiting area, and we say, oh, there's going to be a 3-hour delay. We want to take this other plane. So we waited. got on the plane and were able to fly to safety.
It, yeah.
Wow. Sort of on the listening for each breath. Before I open up to questions, I want to ask you a question. I've worked in conflict zones, Afghanistan and one of the things that we could never do very well was estimate the level of risk. So in those first few days, how were you estimating that level of risk to yourselves? And where were you getting your information from?
At least as far as I'm concerned, Tony convinced me that he'd done this before, he'd gotten other people out in very difficult circumstances. I don't remember if he told us then or if I learned later, but he actually arranged a meeting between two people and changed their race, which is amazing, through his disguise. So, I was convinced that it was going to work.
I think you were talking about the first few days of the takeover.
Although this is really interesting too. But
Well,
Mark, if you wanna
anyway,
take-
I think the answer is that we weren't, because we were too busy trying to not get caught. And so frankly, I don't think we spent a lot of time thinking about what might happen if we were caught. We did have help. We were able to talk to the Charge and the Deputy Chief of Mission who were at the Foreign Ministry. For the first couple of days, the Foreign Ministry did allow telephone contact with them. And so we got guidance from them. We talked to Washington occasionally. We even called our families at one point just to tell them we were okay. But essentially, after the British put us back on the street, we I think that's really the only time we started to get nervous, because we were in this house. We knew that the embassy compound had records of all the leases that the embassy had, and that it was only a matter of time before the militants found those files and would check out these properties. So how much time we had was really the question. And because like Cora said, we were still hoping that somehow this thing would blow over. Admittedly, after the provisional government resigned on the afternoon of November 5th, my hopes diminished significantly, because that meant, Ayatollah Khomeini had sided with the students, and so, I mean, he was the power. And at that point, we did start to worry about risk a little bit, but there was nothing we could do. I mean, we except for one thing, the house we were hiding in had almost nothing in it except a copy of a film of the Shah's coronation. And we said to ourselves, okay, if they catch us, we don't want to see this headline, Americans caught, found watching movie of Shah's coronation, dedicated to the Shah to the end. So we looked for someplace to hide those film canisters. But other than that, there really wasn't much we could do.
So let's open it up for questions. Maybe, I don't know if we've got somebody that can turn up the house lights a little bit, but if you've got a question, please just let me know. I'm going to get you to, because we're recording this, we'd like to make sure we get your question as well. Thank you.
Did you come out on Canadian or American passports?
We were given Canadian passports. It was through a special ordering council, which hadn't been done since World War II, so I guess it's pretty unusual.
You still have them?
Oh no, they took them away as soon as we landed.
Yeah, I might
And
be
our
living here
driver's
now if I
license.
still
And
had
your
that
driver's
passport.
cards.
What did you think of the film?
I think film's great, but it is a film. It's it's Hollywood. I think it's good Hollywood, but it is basically the story of Tony Mendez, and I think somebody described us as minor consultants. I think that was the term in the.
That's what was in my paper.
Well,
yes.
the reason I put minor is because nothing that we told them seemed to register. I mean, I spent I mean, we did talk to the actors who played us, and I think that made a difference. And I spent a lot of time working with the historian on things like, what the office layouts were like and a map of the compound and so forth. But when we tried to explain how the people in Canada might react to the way the Canadian role had been diminished, just no response. I mean, you could tell Ben Affleck was genuinely puzzled. And yet, we told his number one person that this would be the reaction. So I can only describe it as, minor consultant, because they didn't care what we said.
The question over here.
I'm just wondering if you guys have returned to Iran since the incident.
We have not returned to Iran. We were told we were on an arrest list, for one thing. Well, we left illegally. Right? If there were a change in government to a true democracy, I might consider it. It's a very interesting country historically, and the people are very nice. But
As I like to joke, I'm looking for an invitation to the premiere of the Iranian version of Argo. Maybe some of you have heard that they're going to make their own. I think maybe they shoot down the airplane in their version. But anyway, no, seriously, it would be. It was about 30 years ago that I was told we were on an arrest list. That could well have changed, but there's no reason to find out that I can think of. So.
Well, I'm waiting for another question. Oh, we've got one right up there.
Hello. First of all, welcome to Canada.
Thank you.
And I was just wondering, it's always been that sort of thing as you look at a Hollywood event, how it actually came out to be. Really, a lot of Canadians have said, like, if it hadn't been for Ken jumping in there and making all this thing work, how did it work from a perspective of being Americans and looking at the Canadian milieu and that sort of like illegalness of it all? Tell me, both of you, what do you think about all that?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. You mean the fact that the Canadians were willing to break
international law
to
by
harbor us?
Harboring you, yeah. How did that come about in your own heads as it was all unfolding?
Well, honestly, my own opinion is that you do what you have to do. The Iranians created the situation that made it necessary for the Canadians to issue us the passports against their own law and obviously against international law in some sense. But what else are you going to do? There was no alternative way to get us out of the country. I don't think turning us over to the Iranians would have been a good idea for obvious reasons, but it certainly wouldn't have furthered international law. So I don't know. I never thought about it. And in fairness, I did not realize that issuing Canadian passports to us was a big deal. I mean, the CIA makes passports all the time. I just figured, the RCMP or somebody equivalent would just print them in the basement somewhere and ship them off to Tehran, and that would be that. So it never occurred to me that this would be a big deal that would require the action of the Prime Minister and the Governor General and all that stuff.
pretty much agree with what Mark said. Yeah.
Another question. How were you treated when you got back to the United States by the Foreign Service and the White House?
Well, I think I was treated reasonably well by the Foreign Service. I was told that I could have my choice of assignment, so I asked for Wellington. I ended up in Hong Kong. So, I mean, Hong Kong is not a
Life
bad
of
place,
a foreign service.
It wasn't exactly what I was told by the Director General, who's our senior personnel guy, should happen. But aside from that, I did feel like I would have a certain immunity over, in terms of avoiding bad assignments, and I did. I mean, the rest of my assignments were all really good, I think. Maybe others, I mean, Poland in 1988 was still a little tough, but since I am Polish, I had relatives there, I really wanted to go, and it was an excellent job and a lot of fun. So I think the service was good to us. Now, the White House, we were taken to see the president on our first day back in Washington. We weren't told ahead of time, and I think the reason for that is because the first group of hostages to be released, some of you may recall that Ayatollah Khomeini, as a gesture of Islamic compassion or something like that, released 13 African American and female hostages around Thanksgiving of 1979, and some of them did not want to meet with the president because they really felt that he'd kind of, well, when he admitted the Shah and didn't do anything for our security, that he'd kind of, hung us out to dry, basically. So I think for that reason, we weren't given a choice. We were in the Secretary of State's office, and he just said to us, we're going to go to the White House. So, I'm not going to, what are you going to do? You tell the Secretary of State, no, I'm not, But actually, I do think we owed it to the president. I'd be happy to talk about policy. I think he made a lot of mistakes, but I think approving that operation showed a lot of guts because it was an audacious plan. I think it was a good plan, but if it had failed, he and the United States would have been, the laughingstock of the world. I mean, people would have said, what kind of dumb idea was this? Hollywood film crew? I mean, and so that would have killed his re-election chances. I mean, they were already in trouble, but for sure. So he took a risk, and I think we needed, or rather it was fair that we thank him in person for what he did, and we took, did want to do that. Yeah, there we are, that's right.
This incident at that time was very unprecedented. Unfortunately, nowadays you see lots of flag burning or attacks on the embassies, especially America. But at that time, I think this was the first time. What was your own feeling about the people who did it, or were you in shock, or could you just say, okay, we were just assumed that it was just coming, we didn't see it? What was your thinking about the incident at that time?
Well, unfortunately, we did see it. One of the, in the movie they showed the Iranians assembling documents. One of the documents they assembled was a memo from the country director for Iran to our chargé, talking about the admission of the Shah and possible consequences. Also, in his memoirs, the president's chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan, talks about the president. He quotes the president as saying to his national security team on the day that he approved admitting the Shah, what are you guys going to tell me when they take our people hostage? So it was not something that just came out of the blue. I mean, it was actively discussed within the upper levels of the department and the White House. As far as what's happened since, I think your point is valid that there's a lot more violence against embassies. You can argue it's, the causes are open, obviously, to discussion, but we had the opportunity to meet with one of the former hostages last week, one who was subjected to particularly difficult treatment, and what he told me was it should have been considered an act of war, and that he believes it was appropriate, would have been appropriate for the United States to retaliate, even if it meant risking the lives of the hostages. And since he was a hostage, I think he has the right to make that statement. He personally feels that a lot of what's happened since is due to the fact that the Iranians essentially got away with what they did. I mean, and they did get away with it. They didn't release the hostages because of anything that we did. They released them because they reached the end of their use in terms of, they were used to discredit and demolish the secular democratic opposition and leave no alternative to the religious leadership in Iran. And that's what they did with the hostages and the documents that they found in the embassy. And once that process was over, they had no further need for the hostages. And especially when the war with Iraq began, the hostages became a serious obstacle because countries didn't want to sell munitions and spare parts to Iran because they were holding the hostages, and that made it harder to fight the war. So basically, they gave up the hostages on their own terms. And whether that has encouraged both Iran and other similar countries to pursue more aggressive policies against diplomatic establishments, it's a good question.
Baharuk has to do the full round here. Maybe we can pass the mic along. Thank you.
I wanted to ask how many hostages in there, and how much later was it after you had escaped Iran? How much later the remainder of them were released?
52 hostages were held for 444 days. A 53rd, I think, was there until July of 1980, but he developed MS. They didn't know quite what was happening. They were afraid at that point he was going to die on them, so they released him. And then there were the 13 blacks and women that were released in November of 1979.
Basically, it was 1 year, almost to the day after we left, that the majority of the hostages were released.
So how much time were you actually in the Canadian Embassy or in hiding before you got there? How many days?
79 days with the
79
Canadians.
days.
A good 79 days.
As we're here, before we go to the question, how many of us remember that experience, watching it on TV? Some of us would have maybe not even been born in the room. But
Don't remind me.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your stay with the Sheerdowns and about Ken Taylor. And did you keep in touch with them after you came back? And yeah, just a little bit more about your stay with them and what it was like for those 3 months sort of being cooped up.
Well, we can't speak to the Stafford's experience at the ambassador's residence, but at the Sheerdowns, the four of us kind of had our own routine each morning, and then in the afternoon we would get together and play games, and we'd wait for John to come home. He was kind of like Big Daddy, as Bob called him, and he'd bring the news of the day of what was going on, any news about the hostages, and then we'd sit down to a very formal dinner, and that was kind of our everyday routine. And Zena was at home, but she left us on our own and kind of kept to herself, and I think that probably was good, just the four of us, you know, having our time together, and then she would join us basically before dinner.
I liked the after-dinner sessions because that's when we would talk about the political developments. We'd move to the den and you know, have drinks and well, just talk. And it was a very family atmosphere. I think John was an incredible guy. He passed away in December after a struggle with Alzheimer's, but he was a real hero in my opinion. And he, well, I don't know, he just seemed to have a knack, you know, for knowing what we needed in terms of reassurance, and well, he made our life really exceptional. I almost say it was surreal how well we lived, you know, the parties that they organized, it was, especially when you consider we were in the midst of this very hostile atmosphere, and you know, our colleagues were hostages, and here we were living this exceptional life. I mean, it was strange, but you know, certainly not unpleasant. And I can't thank John and Zena enough, really.
Do you think the Hollywood option would have been a viable option if it was presented to you today because people could check the validity of it on the internet?
Well, but there was an office set up. There was a real production team, and there were advertisements. So I think
yeah, it was a real production company. I mean, it fooled Steven Spielberg. He tried to submit a script to Studio 6, so it wasn't. But your point, though, your broader point is one that we've thought about a lot as to whether we could have done it today. And I think the answer is probably not, because with the advent of blogging, for example, there would be too many people that would have been crunching those numbers. And there was a fellow named Jean Peltier who worked for La Presse in Montreal, and he crunched the numbers, figured out that there were people out, and took a guess that they were with the Canadian Embassy. And he's the one who eventually broke the story when he learned the Canadian Embassy had closed. But if you multiply Jean Peltier by 1,000, and Peltier had ethics, and when he was asked to sit on the story, he did. But to me, it seems almost inevitable that one of these bloggers would sense the opportunity to become famous and, sell us out. And so that plus cell phones and the availability of instantaneous communications, even within Iran, I think the Revolutionary Guards would have found us pretty quickly with the use of cell phones and the internet and stuff. So the scenario, I think, could still work, but whether the rest of the stuff would work, I kind of doubt.
This is a up-to-date question, I guess. The current status of diplomats in Canada, their morale is very low. They're on strike in various places. And I'm wondering if that's true in your country as well, and why that might be.
I don't, I still have some friends who are active. I've been retired for 16 years, so probably the wrong person to ask. We have someone here who's a current Foreign Service officer who maybe could answer, but I understand there are budget issues with the State Department. I suspect, well, at least some of the people that I know that are involved with the Benghazi thing are unhappy about the fact that the information about that is being withheld from the public. We still don't know a lot about it, and there's I don't think the job's gotten any easier. I think it's gotten an awful lot harder over the years since I retired, and certainly since Iran. And so I don't blame your Foreign Service people. I don't know the exact details of the labor action. I do know it's happening, but what the basis of it is, whether it's financial or otherwise, I don't know. We don't generally go on strike. At least when I was in the Foreign Service, it's just not what you do. But as I said, the life is harder.
Work to rule, I think, rather than strike.
Well, yeah, that work to rule, that would pretty well immobilize the State Department unless things have changed, because most people put in quite a bit more than their legal 8 hours a day. But like I said, I just think that the world is a lot more dangerous place. One of the reasons I retired is my magic had worn off. After Frankfurt, the personnel started talking about Saudi Arabia, and I started thinking about Anacortes. So that was that.
Hello, the movie makes it look like as soon as you stepped off the plane, your escape was announced to the world. I was just wondering about the timing of that, and when it was known what the operation was, and how that affected Canadian-Iran relations.
The story broke very quickly. We actually were met in Frankfurt by a psychiatrist, or a doctor, I guess, head of med, Zurich, and Sheldon Chris, who was head of NEA at the time, and the plan was to have us go into hiding until the hostages were released. And the Staffords and Mark and I were okay with that, but Bob was married, and Lee's mom was having some health issues. So we were discussing that when we got the news that the story had broke. So we were told to quickly grab our stuff, get into this rental van, and we headed off for Germany to get a flight back to the US. So it broke within hours, actually, of our landing in Zurich. And then I believe the Canadian embassy was closed for 8 years, is what we were told. So a really long time.
Yeah, there's no doubt the Canadians paid, a price in terms of commercial relations with Iran. And that's one of the things that obviously we respect, that they were willing to make that sacrifice in order to help us out. And it was a sacrifice for sure.
One of the interesting things I think about your story as well for us as Canadians is we don't actually hear that story about John and Zena, for example. They're not part of our common. I've worked in foreign policy for 25 years. I didn't know the story of John and Zena. We know the story a bit of Ken Taylor. So you talking and telling us, it strikes me that how many of us really know the story of our foreign service and what they do on a regular basis. That was a huge undertaking for several months. That wasn't just a couple of weeks. It was several months at considerable risk to all of them, plus the commercial risk, plus the risks within the Middle East overall in terms of Canada's reputation. And so I appreciate that you're telling us this story that we should probably know in our own history books. Any other questions?
Can I just make one comment? I don't blame Ken Taylor for the fact that the press focused on him. It was, maybe it's just something in the nature of the press, because I know in several cases we would give an interview and we would talk about the shear downs, and then we'd see the interview or the article and no mention of John and Zena. They just edited them out. And the same thing kind of happened to Ken when Tony Mendez was finally allowed to tell his story in 1997. All of a sudden, Taylor, who had been the hero, became the dog. Everybody said, oh, he lied, he exaggerated his role and stuff like that, and it wasn't true. I mean, Ken did exactly what he was asked to do at the time that he did it. And so it seems like the media can handle one hero at a time, and that's it. And everybody else is either doesn't exist or is a bad guy. And I don't know why that would be the case, but it's certainly true. You're right about John and Zena, and it's something that, if I can segue a little bit, that's one of the reasons I wrote my book, because I felt like, especially once I saw the script of Argo, that, and they're not mentioned in Argo, let alone characters. They're not mentioned at all, even in passing. And I thought that was a travesty, and I said so to the people making the movie. But again, being a minor consultant, it didn't do anything. So.
Yes, for Joe Clark. As a prime minister, probably one of our best foreign ministers as well. Just an incredible leader. I'm going to pass it over to Chuck. Before I do that, though, I want to thank all of you for coming out and the questions that you've asked, and we'll have a chance to thank you, but it's been... Yes, and Chuck's going to mention this as well, but it doesn't end here. There's also a book. You have your books here, and so there'll be a chance to purchase a book and get it signed if you'd like. So Chuck, over to you.
Okay, for the form. The back coordinated.